Picture yourself standing on Newgate Street in London on a Tuesday morning in June, 1780. The air carries the smell of coal smoke and human desperation. Behind walls 4 feet thick, built with £50,000 of Parliament's money, that's £8 million today. Nearly 1,000 souls are trapped in what was supposed to be England's perfect prison. But here's what the history books won't tell you. This wasn't just any prison. This was a machine. A carefully engineered device designed to crush the human spirit so completely that crime itself would wither in its shadow. The architect, George Dance, had studied the psychology of fear like a scientist. Every stone was positioned to whisper the same message: resistance is futile. For 7 centuries, Newgate consumed London's unwanted. Thieves, debtors, political prisoners, women, children, all fed into a system that monetized misery and turned suffering into profit. The guards weren't just guards. They were merchants in a marketplace where hope was currency and despair was inventory. But on June 2nd, 1780, something impossible happened. 40,000 Londoners decided they'd had enough. They didn't just attack the building, they erased it, burned it to ash. And in doing so, they revealed the terrible truth about what happens when a society decides that justice is too important to be left to the people it's supposed to serve. Today, we're opening the sealed files on England's most notorious prison. We're going deep into the blueprints, the ledgers, the architectural psychology that shaped 7 centuries of human suffering. This is the story they buried beneath the Old Bailey, the forgotten nightmare behind Newgate Prison. If you've ever wondered how far a civilization will go to maintain order, stay with us, because what happened at Newgate will change how you see every courthouse, every prison, every institution that claims to serve justice while serving power. Some cities grow around rivers, others around harbors. London grew around a wall, and at one point in that wall, there was a gate. Just a simple opening in stone and timber where Roman engineers had calculated that people needed to pass through. They called it Newgate. New because it replaced something older. Gate because it controlled who moved and who didn't. But here's the thing about gates. They're designed to open and close, and when a city decides it needs more closing than opening, a gate becomes something else entirely. It becomes a trap. For more than 7 centuries, the name Newgate carried a weight that had nothing to do with passage and everything to do with stopping. Because by the medieval period, that simple opening in London's ancient wall had transformed into something far more complex and far more cruel. It had become a prison. Not just any prison, but the prison. The place where London stored its fear. Stand on Newgate Street today and you're standing on archaeology made of suffering. Beneath the modern pavement lie the ghosts of foundation stones laid down in an age when justice was something you could buy by the ounce, and mercy was a luxury item priced out of most people's reach. The street itself remembers. The curve of the roadway still follows the medieval path that once carried carts loaded with condemned bodies toward Tyburn gallows. The very ground beneath your feet has been teaching the same lesson for 800 years. Power moves in straight lines, and the powerless move where power wants them to go. You see, Newgate wasn't just built as a prison. It was built as a piece of urban infrastructure, like a sewer system or a bridge, but for human disposal. The architects and city planners of medieval London understood something that we've forgotten how to say out loud. Every functioning society needs a place to put the people it can't figure out what else to do with, and if that place is visible enough, terrifying enough, notorious enough, then maybe it can do double duty. Maybe it can serve as both container and advertisement, storage and warning label. The genius of Newgate's location wasn't accidental. Medieval urban planning was nothing if not practical. They built the prison within walking distance of the law courts, so prisoners could be moved efficiently from cell to trial to sentence. They built it beside the major trade routes, so merchants and travelers would see it as they entered the city. They built it near the financial district because debt was already a crime, and proximity meant faster processing. Most importantly, they built it where the old gate had been, because gates are about control, and control was the entire point. But there's something else about that location. something that becomes clear only when you trace the flow of bodies, paperwork, and money through the medieval city. Newgate wasn't just convenient, it was hydraulic. The prison functioned like a valve in the city's circulatory system, regulating the pressure of disorder. When crime spiked, the valve tightened. When public anxiety mounted, more bodies flowed into the stone chambers. When the crowd demanded satisfaction, the valve opened in the other direction, releasing prisoners toward the gallows. The building itself was designed to make this flow visible. Its facade faced the main street like a theater marquee advertising the show inside. Passers-by could see the barred windows, hear the sounds leaking through the walls, smell the concentrated misery that no amount of stone could contain. This wasn't poor planning. This was the plan. Terror as public service. But terror is expensive to maintain. And by the 13th century, London was learning that lesson the hard way. The first Newgate wasn't really a purpose-built prison at all. It was more like a repurposed warehouse with bars, a collection of chambers and cells that had evolved organically as the city's needs changed. Some spaces held felons awaiting trial. Others held debtors who couldn't pay their creditors. Still others held political prisoners whose only crime was disagreeing with whoever happened to be in power that particular week. In theory, these were different categories of prisoner requiring different types of custody. In practice, they were all just bodies taking up space in the dark. Because the real infrastructure of Newgate wasn't architectural. It was financial. It was the intricate web of fees, bribes, and informal payments that determined whether you ate today or starved until tomorrow. Whether you slept on a bed or on stone. Whether you froze alone or crowded together with strangers for warmth. The keeper's ledgers from this period read like accountancy textbooks written in hell. Entry fees upon arrival. Discharge fees upon release. Fees for food, for bedding, for candles. For news from the outside world, fees for the privilege of receiving visitors, fees for the right to send messages, fees essentially for remaining human while the building tried to convince you that you weren't. But the most expensive fee was the one they never wrote down in the ledgers, the price of the keeper's discretion, because in a system where survival depended on payment, the guards weren't really guards. They were brokers, merchants in a marketplace where the currency was suffering and the inventory was hope. A prisoner with money could buy almost anything. Better quarters, regular meals, alcohol to numb the daily reality of confinement, news of family, updates on legal proceedings, even conjugal visits arranged with careful timing and careful blindness from the staff. In extreme cases, with enough coin and enough connections, a prisoner could buy something approximating freedom. Day parole to conduct business. Extended visits to taverns, even overnight releases, as long as they returned by morning and no one asked inconvenient questions. But a prisoner without money entered a different economy entirely. An economy where warmth was scarce, where food was irregular, where sickness spread like gossip and medical care was a fantasy. These prisoners didn't just serve time, they served as examples, living proof that poverty wasn't just unfortunate, it was evidence of moral failure deserving of architectural punishment. The brilliance of this system, from the authorities' perspective, was its self-regulating nature. The prison didn't need a large budget for operations because operations largely funded themselves through fees. It didn't need sophisticated security protocols because desperate prisoners were more likely to inform on each other in exchange for tiny privileges. Most importantly, it didn't need to justify its cruelty to the public because cruelty was the point. The worse conditions became, the more effective the deterrent. But medieval cities have a way of outgrowing medieval solutions, and by the 17th century, London was straining against every system designed to contain it. The problem was scale. London in 1600 contained perhaps 100,000 people. London in 1650 contained closer to 200,000. And growing cities generate crime like engines generate heat as an inevitable byproduct of their normal operation. More people meant more theft. More trade meant more fraud. More anonymity meant more opportunity for deception. More desperation meant more willingness to risk everything on ventures that might land you in Newgate. The old prison, designed for a smaller city with simpler problems, was drowning in its own success. Cells designed for one prisoner held 3 or 4. Corridors meant for guards became sleeping spaces for overflow inmates. The courtyard, originally intended as an exercise area, became a kind of open-air dormitory where prisoners lived rough in all weather. But overcrowding wasn't just a management problem, it was a biological time bomb. Medieval medicine had no real understanding of contagion, but even medieval authorities could observe cause and effect. Pack enough unwashed, undernourished, stressed human bodies into a confined space, and disease would follow like a loyal dog. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, Newgate became an incubator for every epidemic that swept through London, and epidemics, unlike prisoners, couldn't be contained by walls. The city faced a choice: expand the prison, reform the system, or accept that their solution to disorder was creating more disorder. They chose expansion, because expansion felt like control. And anyway, the Great Fire of 1666 was about to make the choice for them. September 2nd, 1666. A baker's oven in Pudding Lane. A spark that became a flame, that became an inferno that consumed 13,000 houses and 87 churches, and the old Newgate prison along with them. 4 days of fire that melted the medieval city like candle wax and left London face to face with a choice between restoration and reinvention. When the smoke cleared and the ruins cooled, Newgate was gone. Burnt out, structurally damaged, reduced to blackened stone and twisted iron. The prisoners had been evacuated or released. The guards had fled. The records had burned. For a brief moment, London had a chance to imagine itself without its most notorious landmark, a city that might choose mercy over fear, healing over punishment, some new approach to the ancient problem of human disorder. Instead, they rebuilt it, bigger. The post-fire reconstruction of London was overseen by some of the most brilliant architects and engineers of the age: Christopher Wren, Robert Hooke, John Evelyn, men who understood that cities were more than collections of buildings. They were systems, machines for human habitation. And if you were rebuilding a machine from scratch, you had the opportunity to make it more efficient, more rational, more perfectly suited to its intended purpose. They rebuilt London's churches to inspire the soul toward divine contemplation. They rebuilt the financial district to facilitate the smooth flow of capital and commerce. They rebuilt the residential neighborhoods to provide healthier, more spacious living conditions. And they rebuilt Newgate Prison to inspire terror so pure and so immediate that crime itself might wither in its shadow. The new design wasn't just bigger than its predecessor. It was philosophically different. Where the old prison had evolved organically, accumulating rooms and corridors and customs like sedimentary layers, the new prison was engineered from first principles. It was a purpose-built fear machine, designed by professionals who understood that architecture could be a form of psychological warfare. The facade alone was a masterpiece of intimidation. Massive stone blocks cut with mathematical precision and assembled without ornament or decoration of any kind. Windows placed too high for any passerby to see inside, but positioned perfectly to let prisoners see out onto the freedom they'd forfeited. Doors thick enough to muffle screams, but thin enough to let through just enough sound to remind the neighborhood what happened to people who broke the rules. But the real genius was in the details, in the way the entrance narrowed as you approached, creating a funnel effect that made visitors feel compressed and diminished. In the way the stonework was left deliberately rough, so that touching the walls would scratch and scrape. In the way the entire structure seemed to lean slightly inward, as if the building itself were listening to everything that happened inside. This wasn't accidental. The architects of post-fire Newgate had studied the psychology of deterrence like scientists. They understood that effective punishment wasn't just about containing criminals. It was about communicating with potential criminals. The building itself had to serve as a warning. Every stone had to whisper, "This could be you." And for a while, it worked. Crime rates in London did drop in the immediate aftermath of Newgate's reopening. The new prison's reputation preceded it. Stories circulated through the taverns and markets about the conditions inside, about the sounds that echoed through the vaulted chambers, about prisoners who entered healthy and emerged broken. The building's very existence changed the mathematics of criminal enterprise. For many potential lawbreakers, the risk-to-reward ratio had shifted decisively toward compliance. But buildings age, reputations fade, and human beings have an extraordinary capacity to adapt to even the most carefully calibrated forms of psychological pressure. By the 1740s, London's crime rates were climbing again. Newgate was as crowded as it had ever been, and the authorities were beginning to realize that their perfect deterrent machine had a fundamental design flaw. It was slowly killing everyone inside it. The problem wasn't just overcrowding, although overcrowding remained a constant crisis. The problem was that the new prison, designed primarily for intimidation, had sacrificed basic human survival requirements in service of psychological impact. The thick walls that made the building look impregnable also prevented air circulation. The high windows that denied privacy to inmates also limited natural light. The massive doors that symbolized permanence also trapped heat, cold, moisture, and the accumulated breath of hundreds of human beings in various states of physical and emotional distress. By the 1750s, it was clear that something had to be done, not out of humanitarian concern. Humanitarian concern was not a governing principle in 18th-century criminal justice, but out of practical necessity. Because a prison that killed its inmates faster than the courts could process them was a prison that wasn't fulfilling its basic function as part of the legal system. Dead prisoners couldn't serve as examples. Dead prisoners couldn't be transported to the colonies. Dead prisoners couldn't pay fees to their keepers. The solution, when it came, was characteristically 18th century in its faith that engineering could solve problems created by engineering. In 1752, they installed a windmill on the roof of Newgate Prison. Picture it, a massive stone fortress designed to embody the implacable power of state punishment, crowned with a traditional Dutch windmill like some sort of architectural joke. The windmill was connected to a ventilation system that was supposed to draw fresh air down into the cells and corridors and push the accumulated stench and contagion back out into the London sky. The windmill on Newgate's roof was both an admission of failure and a statement of faith, an admission that the prison was essentially uninhabitable without mechanical intervention, and a statement of faith that mechanical intervention could make the uninhabitable humane enough to serve the state's purposes. The irony was perfect. A building designed to demonstrate human powerlessness had become so effective at its job that it required rescue by technology. The prison was imprisoning itself. But the windmill did work after a fashion. Infant mortality rates inside Newgate did drop. Epidemic diseases became less frequent. Prisoners who might have died in their first month of confinement survived long enough to stand trial. The machine was learning to preserve its own inventory. Yet even as the immediate crisis of air quality was being addressed through engineering, London's authorities were grappling with a larger question. What happened when your solution to social disorder became a form of social disorder itself? Because by the middle of the 18th century, Newgate Prison wasn't just containing crime. It was generating new forms of crime. It was creating its own ecosystem of corruption, its own economy of desperation, its own culture of violence that leaked out into the surrounding neighborhoods like contaminated water from a broken pipe. The problem wasn't that the prison was failing to deter crime. The problem was that it was deterring crime while simultaneously creating criminals. Guards who took bribes, families who stole to pay prison fees, former inmates who emerged from confinement more skilled in criminal arts than when they'd entered. The building was supposed to be London's immune system, but it was behaving more like an infection. Parliament's response, when it came, was predictably ambitious and typically expensive. In 1767, they voted to allocate £50,000, a staggering sum equivalent to roughly £8 million today, for the complete reconstruction of Newgate Prison. Not renovation, not expansion, complete reconstruction. They were going to tear down the post-fire prison and replace it with something even more perfectly suited to the task of containing and deterring criminal behavior. £50,000 bought a lot of expertise. The project was placed in the hands of George Dance the Younger, one of London's most accomplished architects and the official city surveyor. Dance had designed some of the city's most elegant private residences and most innovative public buildings. He understood proportion, symmetry, the subtle ways that architectural choices could influence human behavior and emotion. If anyone could solve the puzzle of designing a humane deterrent, a prison that was both terrifying and livable, it would be Dance. The architectural brief was unlike anything Dance had tackled before. The building had to be escape-proof, which meant thick walls and minimal windows and doors that could withstand sustained assault. It had to be intimidating from the street, which meant a facade that communicated power and permanence and the futility of resistance. It had to segregate different categories of prisoner, which meant careful internal planning and multiple separate circulation routes. It had to accommodate the existing fee-based economy that kept the prison financially viable, which meant spaces where money could be discreetly exchanged and privileges quietly delivered. But it also had to be healthy enough that inmates could survive their confinement, which meant ventilation and drainage and careful attention to the flow of air and light and water through the building. It had to be secure without being lethally oppressive, terrifying without being murderous. It had to embody the perfect balance between mercy and justice that somehow no one had yet figured out how to achieve. Dance spent months studying the site, interviewing keepers and prisoners and court officials, examining the records of similar institutions throughout Europe. He consulted with physicians about disease transmission, with engineers about structural integrity, with administrators about operational efficiency. He was designing more than a building. He was designing a piece of social machinery, a technology for converting criminal behavior into civic compliance. The plans he eventually produced were masterful. The new Newgate would be built around a central courtyard, with separate wings for different categories of prisoner radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. The design would facilitate surveillance and control while providing natural light and air circulation. It would accommodate nearly twice as many inmates as the existing structure, while maintaining the segregation necessary to prevent the most dangerous prisoners from corrupting the merely unfortunate. Most importantly, from the authorities' perspective, the new design would solve the public relations problem that had been plaguing English criminal justice for decades. It would demonstrate that the state could be both firm and fair, powerful and humane. The building itself would serve as proof that English justice was superior to the arbitrary cruelties practiced on the continent. On paper, it was perfect. In stone and iron and human flesh, it would become something else entirely. Construction began in May 1770. The first stone was laid with ceremonial precision, and the project proceeded with the methodical efficiency that characterized the best English engineering of the period. Contractors delivered materials on schedule. Masons worked from detailed plans that specified every dimension and angle. Ironworkers forged gates and bars to specifications measured in fractions of inches, but materials have their own logic, and that logic doesn't always align with human intentions. The stone proved more difficult to work than anticipated. The iron required repeated adjustments to fit properly with the masonry. The drainage systems needed to be redesigned when the original plans failed to account for London's unpredictable geology. What was supposed to be a 2-year project stretched into 3 years, then 4, then 5. And while construction proceeded, crime in London didn't pause politely. The old prison continued to operate, overcrowded and increasingly decrepit. Prisoners continued to be sentenced and confined, and fed into a system that everyone knew was inadequate. The courts continued to send bodies to Newgate faster than Newgate could process them. Pressure was building throughout the criminal justice system like steam in a boiler without a safety valve. By the time the new prison finally opened its doors, it was already operating at capacity. The perfect balance that Dance had engineered between deterrence and habitability was immediately thrown off by the sheer volume of human misery that London's courts continued to produce. The building was designed for 800 prisoners. It opened with nearly 1,000. The system was failing before it had a chance to succeed. But failure in the context of 18th century criminal justice, was a relative concept. The new Newgate was still the most advanced prison in Europe. It still represented the finest thinking about the intersection of architecture and social control. It still embodied the optimistic belief that human institutions could be perfected through careful design and rational administration. It would take a riot to prove how wrong that belief could be. But before the riot, there was the routine, the daily machinery of confinement that transformed Dance's architectural vision into lived experience. Because a prison isn't really a building, it's a process, a series of small repeated transactions between power and powerlessness that accumulate, day by day, into something larger than the sum of their parts. Every morning at dawn, the turnkeys would make their rounds, unlocking doors and counting bodies and assessing the night's damage to both property and personnel. Every afternoon, the courts would send new prisoners to be processed through the intake system that sorted human beings like mail into appropriate categories and destinations. Every evening, the gates would close and the building would settle into the peculiar quiet of hundreds of people trying to sleep while surrounded by strangers and walls and the constant possibility of violence. The new Newgate operated on principles that would have been recognizable to any factory owner of the period: efficiency through specialization, order through classification, productivity through supervision. But the product being manufactured wasn't goods, it was compliance. The raw material being processed wasn't cotton or iron, it was defiance. And the waste byproduct being generated wasn't industrial slag, it was human despair. Dance had divided the new prison into distinct zones, each with its own character and clientele. The common side housed prisoners who couldn't afford better accommodations, thieves and vagrants, and debtors whose poverty had become a criminal offense. The state side housed prisoners who could pay for privileges, merchants charged with fraud, gentlemen accused of assault, political prisoners whose connections afforded them certain protections even in confinement. And then there was the press yard, a separate section with its own entrance, its own guards, its own unwritten rules. The press yard was where Newgate housed its most unusual prisoners, not necessarily the most dangerous, though some were dangerous, not necessarily the most important, though some were important. The press yard housed prisoners whose cases had attracted public attention, whose stories had become entangled with larger questions about justice and power and the proper limits of state authority. The name itself carried historical weight. Press yard, a reference to peine forte et dure, the medieval practice of pressing prisoners who refused to enter a plea by placing heavy stones on their chests until they either spoke or died. The practice had been officially abolished in 1772, but the name lingered like smoke from an extinguished fire, because some forms of pressure don't require stones. In the new Newgate, the press yard functioned as a kind of luxury wing. Prisoners who could afford the fees enjoyed larger cells, better food, more frequent visits, access to books and writing materials. They could receive mail without censorship, conduct business through intermediaries, even host dinner parties with carefully selected guests. For the right price, confinement in the press yard could be made to resemble an extended stay at an exclusive hotel. But luxury is relative, and even the most privileged prisoner was still a prisoner. The press yard had the same thick walls, the same barred windows, the same echoing corridors that amplified every footstep and whispered conversation. The difference was psychological rather than physical. Press yard prisoners were allowed to maintain the fiction that their imprisonment was temporary, exceptional, a bureaucratic misunderstanding that would soon be resolved through proper channels. The fiction was sometimes true. Wealthy prisoners could afford skilled lawyers who knew how to exploit procedural technicalities. They could pay bribes to court officials who might expedite their cases or recommend lenient sentences. They could leverage family connections and business relationships to generate pressure for their release. Money, in the 18th century legal system, was not just power. It was a form of innocence. But sometimes the fiction was just a fiction, and those were the cases that made the press yard something more than a luxury prison. They made it a laboratory for studying the intersection of privilege and powerlessness, wealth and fear, social status and mortal vulnerability. Because even the richest prisoner, even the most connected defendant, even the most carefully protected political prisoner was subject to the ultimate democratic institution of 18th century England, the gallows. Money could buy comfort, but it couldn't buy immortality. Connections could delay justice, but they couldn't deny it indefinitely. And when your execution date was finally set, all the luxury in the world couldn't disguise the fact that you were going to die at a time and place chosen by people who had never asked your permission. This was the contradiction at the heart of Newgate's architecture. The building was designed to maintain order through hierarchy, to prevent violence through segregation, to ensure justice through procedure. But it was also designed to kill people, regularly, publicly, with ceremonial precision. And everyone inside the building, guards and prisoners alike, lived with the knowledge that confinement was often just a waiting period before execution. The proximity to death changed everything. It changed the way prisoners related to each other, because anyone might be gone tomorrow. It changed the way guards related to prisoners, because today's inmate might be tomorrow's corpse. It changed the way the building itself felt, because every corridor led ultimately to the same destination. Dance had tried to design death out of the system by focusing on life. Better ventilation meant fewer disease-related deaths. Improved sanitation meant fewer infections. Proper drainage meant fewer epidemics. Careful classification meant less violence between prisoners. But he couldn't design away the fundamental purpose of the institution, which was to serve as a way station between crime and punishment, between transgression and retribution, between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The new Newgate was, in that sense, perfectly suited to its purpose. It was a machine for converting social disorder into social order through the methodical application of suffering. And like all machines, it required fuel to operate. The fuel was human beings. The waste product was human waste. The efficiency measurement was the speed with which input could be converted to output. By 1780, the machine was operating at peak efficiency. Crime rates in London had stabilized. Court backlogs had been reduced. The prison was processing prisoners smoothly from intake to disposal. The system was working exactly as designed, which is why no one was prepared for what happened when the system itself became the target. May 1770. The sound of hammers on stone echoing through Newgate Street like a slow, persistent heartbeat. George Dance's vision was finally taking physical form, one carefully measured block at a time. But construction in the heart of London was never just construction, it was performance. Street theater played out in limestone and iron for an audience of merchants, laborers, pickpockets, and thieves who gathered daily to watch the city's new nightmare being assembled piece by piece. The work site itself was a study in contradictions. Skilled masons laying foundation stones with mathematical precision while apprentice boys hauled buckets of mortar through streets barely wide enough for a single cart. Master craftsmen installing ironwork designed to last centuries, while curious onlookers pressed close enough to touch the bars that would soon contain London's most desperate criminals. The building was rising from the ground like some enormous fossil being excavated in reverse, each day revealing more of the skeleton that would house the city's fear. But materials have their own stubborn logic, and London's geology had never been consulted about Parliament's timeline. The ground beneath Newgate Street was a mixture of clay, gravel, and medieval refuse that shifted unpredictably under the weight of Dance's massive stone blocks. Foundation work that should have taken months stretched into seasons. Deliveries of cut stone were delayed by winter weather, spring flooding, summer heat that made heavy labor nearly impossible. The iron fittings, forged to specifications measured in fractions of inches, required constant adjustment as the masonry settled and shifted. Each delay meant more money. Each revision meant more time. Each setback meant more pressure from Parliament, from the courts, from a city that was generating criminals faster than the old prison could process them. By 1773, 3 years into construction, The project was consuming money like a furnace consumes coal. The original £50,000 budget had been exhausted and supplemented twice. Contractors were demanding additional payments. Subcontractors were threatening to abandon the project entirely. Meanwhile, prisoners continued to arrive at the old Newgate at a rate that made overcrowding seem like an optimistic term. Cells designed for solitary confinement held 3 or 4 inmates. Corridors meant for circulation became sleeping spaces. The exercise yard resembled a refugee camp where humanity pressed against the limits of physical space and human patience. The building was failing in real time while its replacement rose with glacial slowness across the street. The irony was perfect and perfectly visible to anyone walking through the neighborhood. London's solution to the problem of criminal containment was itself trapped in a system where good intentions moved at the speed of bureaucracy while human misery operated according to the laws of physics. Supply and demand, cause and effect, action and reaction. The old prison was a pressure vessel approaching its limit while the new prison remained a construction site, promising relief that always seemed to be just one more season away. But when the new Newgate finally opened its doors in 1775, 5 years behind schedule and dramatically over budget, it was immediately clear that Dance had created something unprecedented. Not just a prison, but a masterpiece of institutional architecture. A building that managed to be simultaneously magnificent and terrifying, imposing and functional, a physical embodiment of the state's power to punish and its capacity for mercy. The facade alone was worth the wait. Massive ashlar blocks fitted so tightly that no mortar was visible in the joints. Windows positioned with geometric precision, each one exactly the same size and placed at exactly the same interval, creating a rhythm that suggested both order and inevitability. The main entrance was framed by columns that referenced classical antiquity, while the ironwork above the door incorporated motifs that spoke unmistakably of confinement. This wasn't just architecture. This was propaganda carved in stone. But the real innovation was inside. Dance had solved the fundamental problem that had plagued prison design for centuries: how to maintain security while preserving basic human habitability. His solution was segregation on a scale and with a sophistication that no previous institution had attempted. The new Newgate wasn't one prison. It was several prisons operating within a single structure, each with its own entrance, its own circulation patterns, its own internal economy. The division wasn't arbitrary. It was forensic. Dance understood that different categories of prisoner required different types of containment, different levels of security, different approaches to the balance between punishment and preservation. A debtor who couldn't pay his creditors posed different risks than a highway robber who had terrorized coaches on the Bath Road. A political prisoner charged with seditious libel required different handling than a pickpocket caught working the crowds at Bartholomew Fair. The common side was designed for volume: large cells that could accommodate multiple prisoners, communal spaces where inmates could work and eat and attempt to maintain some semblance of social life under conditions of controlled deprivation. The architecture here was functional rather than punitive, sturdy rather than elegant. The state's position was clear: if you couldn't afford better treatment, you would receive exactly as much comfort as was necessary to keep you alive until your case could be resolved. The state's side operated according to different principles entirely. Here, architecture became hospitality. Larger cells, better ventilation, access to natural light that wasn't filtered through bars designed to remind you of your captivity. Prisoners on the state side could receive visitors with minimal supervision, conduct correspondence without censorship, even arrange for meals to be delivered from taverns outside the prison walls. The message was equally clear. Money didn't buy innocence, but it could buy dignity. But it was the division between these two worlds that revealed the true sophistication of Dance's design. The common side and state side shared the same building, breathed the same air, existed within the same legal framework. But they might as well have been located on different continents. Prisoners on one side could hear the voices of prisoners on the other side, but they couldn't see them, couldn't reach them, couldn't communicate with them except through the intermediation of guards who controlled every form of contact between the two populations. This wasn't accidental. Dance had studied the history of prison riots, prison escapes, prison reforms. He understood that the greatest threat to institutional order came not from individual desperation, but from collective action. Desperate prisoners acting alone could be contained through walls and locks and the constant threat of violence. Desperate prisoners acting together could overwhelm any physical security system ever designed. Segregation was the solution. If prisoners couldn't organize across categories, they couldn't organize at all. If they couldn't communicate freely, they couldn't coordinate resistance. If they couldn't even see each other, they couldn't develop the sense of shared grievance that transformed individual suffering into collective rage. The genius of the system was its psychological elegance. Prisoners on the common side knew that better conditions existed just yards away, but they couldn't access those conditions no matter how much they suffered. Prisoners on the state side knew that worse conditions existed just yards away, but they couldn't improve those conditions no matter how much they sympathized. Everyone was trapped not just by walls and bars, but by the architecture of inequality itself. Yet even the most carefully designed system requires human implementation. And humans, Dance was about to learn, were the most unreliable component of any institutional machine. The daily operation of the new Newgate depended entirely on the prison staff, turnkeys, guards, clerks, and keepers who translated architectural theory into lived experience. These were men who worked for wages that barely qualified as poverty, who supervised populations that outnumbered them 20-1, who were expected to maintain order through a combination of authority they didn't possess and violence they weren't officially permitted to use. The result was an economy of corruption that made the old fee-based system look straightforward by comparison. In the new Newgate, everything was officially regulated and unofficially negotiable. Food delivery schedules existed on paper, but actual meals depended on payments that were never recorded in any ledger. Visiting hours were clearly posted, but actual visits could be arranged at any time for the right consideration. Medical care was theoretically available to all prisoners, but actually receiving treatment required navigating a complex network of bribes, favors, and personal relationships that functioned like a black market in basic human services. The guards weren't criminals in any formal sense. They were entrepreneurs operating within a system that paid them too little to survive honestly and gave them too much unsupervised access to people who were desperate enough to pay any price for small improvements in their daily existence. A guard who could arrange for a letter to be delivered without inspection could charge whatever the sender could afford. A guard who could provide advance warning of surprise cell searches could command premium prices from prisoners who had contraband to hide. A guard who could ensure that a particular prisoner wasn't selected for transport to the hulks or the colonies could essentially auction that protection to the highest bidder. But the most valuable commodity in this underground economy wasn't food or comfort or communication. It was information. Knowledge of court schedules, jury selections, judicial moods, news of pardons being considered, sentences being commuted, executions being postponed, updates on family members, business associates, political developments that might affect a prisoner's case. In a world where your life depended on decisions being made by people you couldn't see in rooms you couldn't access, information became currency. The irony was that this corruption served the institution's official purposes almost as effectively as honest administration might have. Prisoners who could buy small privileges were less likely to revolt against the system entirely. Guards who had financial incentives to maintain order were more motivated to prevent riots, escapes, or other disruptions that might attract unwanted attention from their superiors. The black market in comfort and information created a stakeholder class within the prison population, people who had something to lose if the system collapsed. But markets are unstable by definition, and the prison's internal economy was about to be tested by forces that no amount of bribery could control. The new Newgate was connected to London's legal system like an organ connected to a circulatory system. Prisoners flowed in from the courts at a rate determined by crime, prosecution, and judicial scheduling. They flowed out toward transportation, execution, or release at a rate determined by sentence, appeal, and administrative processing. The building was designed to accommodate this flow efficiently, but efficiency assumed predictability. and predictability assumed that the larger system would continue to function according to established patterns. By 1778, those patterns were beginning to break down. The American War had disrupted transportation to the colonies, backing up the pipeline of prisoners who were supposed to be shipped overseas to serve their sentences in productive labor. Ships that would normally have carried convicted felons to Virginia or Maryland were instead carrying soldiers and supplies to fight a rebellion that was proving far more expensive and far less successful than anyone had anticipated. The result was a bottleneck that kept prisoners in Newgate for months or years longer than their sentences had intended. Overcrowding returned with a vengeance. Cells that had been designed for one prisoner held 3. Cells that had been designed for 3 held 6. The careful segregation that Dance had built into the system began to break down under simple arithmetic. Common-side prisoners were moved to stateside cells to make room for new arrivals. Stateside prisoners found themselves doubled up with strangers whose crimes and social backgrounds were entirely different from their own. But the real problem wasn't space. It was time. Prisoners who expected to spend weeks in confinement before being transported or executed found themselves spending months or years. The psychological architecture of the prison, the sense that suffering was temporary, that confinement was a way station rather than a destination, collapsed under the weight of indefinite delay. Indefinite imprisonment changes people in ways that temporary imprisonment doesn't. Hope becomes a liability. Patience becomes self-destruction. The small compromises and daily accommodations that make short-term confinement bearable become intolerable when extended indefinitely. Prisoners who had accepted their situations as temporary misfortunes began to see them as permanent injustices. And injustice, unlike individual suffering, is contagious. The transformation was visible in the daily routines that structured prison life. Morning roll calls that had once been conducted with sullen compliance became opportunities for small acts of resistance. Meal times that had once been merely unpleasant became occasions for vocal complaints about food quality, portion sizes, and the arbitrary timing of distribution. Exercise periods that had once provided relief from confinement became gatherings where grievances could be shared and amplified through repetition. The guards noticed the change first. Conversations that stopped when they approached. Looks that held just a fraction of a second too long. Small acts of defiance that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested a shift in the prison's psychological equilibrium. The fear that had once regulated behavior was being replaced by something else. Not courage exactly, but the recognition that fear itself could become more unbearable than the consequences of resisting it. By 1780, the new Newgate had been operating for 5 years. It housed nearly 1,000 prisoners in a space designed for 800. It processed cases at a rate that satisfied the courts while maintaining order through a combination of architectural intimidation, economic corruption, and the constant threat of violence. By every official measure, the institution was a success. But success in institutional terms often looks different from success in human terms. And the humans inside Newgate, prisoners and guards alike, were about to remind the city that buildings don't control people. People control buildings, and when enough people decide that a building represents everything they hate about the world outside its walls, architecture becomes irrelevant. The weakness in Dance's design wasn't structural, it wasn't administrative, it wasn't even financial. The weakness was philosophical. He had designed a perfect machine for containing individual prisoners, but he had failed to account for the possibility that prisoners might stop seeing themselves as individuals and start seeing themselves as a population with grievances, a population with shared interests, a population with nothing left to lose. On the 2nd of June, 1780, that population was about to meet another population on the streets of London, and the collision would test every assumption upon which the prison system had been built. But before we reach that collision, we need to understand the machine that Dance had actually built. Not the theoretical prison described in architectural drawings, but the operational reality of daily life inside walls designed to contain the worst impulses of human nature, while somehow preserving the humanity of the people subjected to that containment. The morning routine began before dawn, turnkeys moving through corridors with keys that weighed as much as hammers, unlocking doors in a sequence that had been choreographed to prevent any possibility of multiple cells being opened simultaneously. The sound of iron on iron echoing through vaulted spaces designed to amplify every noise into a reminder of captivity. Prisoners emerging from cells that had held them for 12 hours of darkness, blinking in the filtered light that passed for morning in a building where windows were positioned to provide illumination without hope. Roll call. Names read from ledgers in voices that reduced human beings to entries in an administrative inventory. Present or absent, alive or dead, accounted for or missing. The bureaucracy of bodies that reduced each prisoner to a number in a system that processed people like any other form of raw material. The state's daily confirmation that it knew where you were, what you were doing, whether you continued to exist in a form that served its purposes. Breakfast, when it came, was distributed according to protocols that revealed the true hierarchy of the prison's social organization. Stateside prisoners received meals that approximated the food served in London's better taverns. Meat, bread, beer, vegetables prepared with enough care to suggest that the people consuming them retained some claim to basic human dignity. Common-side prisoners received gruel, bread that was more sawdust than flour, water that tasted of iron and tasted of the pipes that carried it through a building where plumbing was an afterthought to security. But the real meal was information. Gossip passed from guard to prisoner, from prisoner to prisoner, from the outside world to the inside world, through networks of communication that operated below the surface of official prison administration. News of court proceedings, jury verdicts, sentences handed down, and appeals filed. Updates on families, businesses, political developments that might affect individual cases. The currency of hope and despair that prisoners traded with each other, like merchants trading goods in a marketplace, where the only inventory was human emotion. Work details provided structure to days that otherwise would have stretched like endless corridors toward evening lockdown. Prisoners on good behavior could be assigned to kitchen duty, laundry service, general maintenance of the prison infrastructure. The work wasn't rehabilitation in any modern sense. It was occupation. Something to do with hands and minds that might otherwise turn toward activities that the administration preferred to discourage. But work also provided opportunities. Kitchen duty meant access to better food, either through theft or through arrangements with guards who were willing to overlook small infractions in exchange for small considerations. Laundry duty meant contact with the outside world through the clothing and linens that were sent in for cleaning. Maintenance duty meant knowledge of the building's structural vulnerabilities, the locations of weak locks, loose stones, drainage systems that might be exploited by prisoners clever enough to think in terms of engineering rather than desperation. The most valued work assignment was library duty. Dance had included a small library in his design, partly out of humanitarian impulse and partly out of practical recognition that educated prisoners caused fewer problems than illiterate ones. Books provided escape in the most literal sense, mental transportation to worlds that existed beyond the reach of walls and bars. But they also provided tools, legal texts that might help prisoners understand their rights, historical accounts that might suggest strategies for resistance, technical manuals that might reveal useful information about locks, masonry, or metallurgy. The library was officially supervised, but supervision was a relative concept in an institution where guards were outnumbered 20-1 by the people they were supposed to control. Books disappeared and reappeared. Pages were torn out and passed from cell to cell. Information flowed through the prison like water through porous stone, finding pathways that no administrator could map or control. Afternoons were for visiting, when the prison's carefully maintained boundaries between inside and outside became permeable in ways that the architects had never intended. Family members brought news, money, food, and sometimes contraband that ranged from tobacco to tools to messages from Confederates who were still operating on the outside. Lawyers brought legal documents, strategic advice, and occasionally hope in the form of procedural technicalities that might result in reduced sentences or overturned convictions. But visitors also brought fear of what their imprisoned relatives had become during their confinement, fear of what they themselves might become if their own circumstances changed and they found themselves on the wrong side of the law. fear of the system itself, which could transform anyone from citizen to prisoner with a speed that made mockery of the idea that justice was measured and deliberate. The visiting process was designed to maintain control while allowing contact. Conversations took place in rooms where guards could monitor both speech and behavior. Physical contact was limited to brief embraces at the beginning and end of visits. Gifts were inspected, correspondence was read, money was counted and recorded. But human communication operates through channels that no institutional system can completely regulate. Looks, gestures, coded language, the pressure of a handshake that conveyed more information than hours of conversation. Evenings were for reflection, though reflection in the context of prison life often became rumination on grievances, rehearsal of revenge fantasies, or simply the mental repetition of routines that helped prisoners maintain sanity in an environment designed to erode psychological stability. The silence of evening lockdown was filled with the accumulated breathing of hundreds of people trying to sleep while surrounded by reminders of their powerlessness. But evening was also when the prison's unofficial economy operated most efficiently. Guards who were willing to accept payment for small services, prisoners who had contraband to trade, information networks that operated through whispered conversations, coded knocking on cell walls, or messages passed through cracks in the masonry that connected adjacent cells. The shadow government of the prison, which operated according to rules that had nothing to do with official regulations and everything to do with the fundamental human drive to maintain agency in circumstances designed to eliminate it. The new Newgate had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of unofficial activity. Dance had planned sightlines that eliminated blind spots. He had positioned guards' quarters to provide maximum surveillance of prisoner movement. He had designed communication systems that allowed rapid response to any sign of organized resistance, but he had underestimated the ingenuity of people who had nothing to do with their time except figure out ways to circumvent the systems that controlled their lives. By 1780, the prison contained not one population, but multiple populations, each with its own internal hierarchies, its own codes of conduct, its own strategies for survival. Long-term prisoners who had learned how to navigate the system's informal networks. Short-term prisoners who were still adjusting to the reality of confinement. Political prisoners who saw their imprisonment as temporary inconvenience rather than permanent condition. Criminal prisoners who saw their imprisonment as occupational hazard rather than moral judgment. These populations overlapped and intersected in ways that created opportunities for both cooperation and conflict. A political prisoner might share legal knowledge with a criminal prisoner in exchange for protection from prison violence. A long-term prisoner might provide orientation to new arrivals in exchange for news of the outside world. A wealthy prisoner might pay for services from a poor prisoner who had access to resources that money alone couldn't buy. But the most important dynamic was the relationship between prisoners and the institution itself, because by 1780, many prisoners had been confined long enough to understand that the prison wasn't just a building or a set of rules. It was a system of power relationships that extended far beyond the walls of Newgate Street. The judges who sentenced them, the lawyers who defended them, the merchants who employed them, the politicians who made the laws that criminalized their behavior, all were part of a larger machinery that the prison represented but didn't control. This understanding was dangerous to institutional stability. As long as prisoners saw their confinement as personal misfortune or individual punishment, they remained manageable. But when they began to see their confinement as political oppression or systemic injustice, they became something else entirely. They became a constituency, a population with shared grievances and common interests, a group that might be mobilized for collective action if the right catalyst appeared. That catalyst was about to appear on the streets of London in the form of a crowd that shared the prisoners' sense that the system they lived under was fundamentally unjust, a crowd that was about to discover that the prison they had been taught to fear was also the symbol of everything they had been taught to hate. The collision between these two populations, the confined and the free, the punished and the angry, would reveal that dance's perfect machine for containing disorder was itself a form of disorder, that the solution to crime had become a crime against the city that housed it. that the architecture of justice had become the blueprint for injustice on a scale that no individual building could contain. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Dance's design wasn't architectural at all. It was economic. The new Newgate had been built around an understanding that imprisonment was expensive, and that expense had to be managed through careful allocation of resources between different categories of prisoner. The fee system wasn't corruption, it was financial engineering. The state side operated as a luxury hotel with bars. Prisoners who could afford the premiums received services that approximated the standards they had enjoyed before their confinement. Private cells with furniture, meals prepared to individual specifications, access to books, writing materials, and recreational activities that made time pass more quickly and less painfully. The fees charged for these services weren't arbitrary. They were calculated to cover the actual costs of providing them while generating a surplus that could subsidize the operation of the common side. The common side operated as a minimum security warehouse for human inventory. Prisoners received exactly enough food, shelter, and medical care to keep them alive until their cases could be resolved. Nothing more. The conditions weren't designed to be pleasant or rehabilitative. They were designed to be sustainable at the lowest possible cost to the state while remaining humane enough to avoid generating sympathy that might undermine public support for the prison system as a whole. This financial architecture created incentives that aligned the interests of prisoners, guards, and administrators in ways that promoted institutional stability. Wealthy prisoners had reasons to cooperate with the system that provided them with comfort and dignity. Guards had reasons to maintain order that protected the fee-paying clientele who made their own employment viable. Administrators had reasons to balance punishment with humanity in ways that kept costs manageable while satisfying the public's demand for justice. But the system also created vulnerabilities. It depended on a steady supply of prisoners who could afford to pay premiums for better treatment. It required guards who were willing to provide services without official recognition or protection. Most importantly, it assumed that the distinction between different categories of prisoner would remain stable over time. By 1780, all of these assumptions were being tested. The American War had disrupted trade relationships that had provided the wealth necessary to maintain the stateside's premium pricing. Inflation had eroded the purchasing power of families who were trying to support imprisoned relatives. The delays in transportation and execution had created a population of long-term prisoners who had exhausted their financial resources and could no longer afford the fees that had previously guaranteed them decent treatment. The result was a gradual democratization of suffering. Prisoners who had once been segregated by their ability to pay found themselves sharing cells, meals, and grievances regardless of their social backgrounds or financial circumstances. The careful hierarchy that had prevented collective organization was collapsing under economic pressure that no amount of architectural planning could resist. This collapse was visible in the daily routines that structured prison life. Morning roll calls became exercises in mutual recognition rather than administrative inventory. Prisoners began to see each other as fellow victims of a system that treated wealth as virtue and poverty as vice. Mealtimes became opportunities for political discussion rather than individual consumption. Exercise periods became meetings where grievances could be articulated and strategies discussed. The guards noticed these changes but interpreted them through the lens of individual management problems rather than systemic threats. A prisoner who had previously been compliant might become argumentative. A prisoner who had previously paid fees promptly might begin to negotiate or delay payment. A prisoner who had previously accepted his situation with resignation might begin to ask questions about the legal basis for his continued confinement. These individual changes seemed manageable through traditional disciplinary measures. Solitary confinement for troublemakers, reduced privileges for those who failed to pay fees, transfer to less desirable cells for those who questioned authority. But the guards failed to recognize that they were treating symptoms rather than causes, and that the cause was the gradual breakdown of the economic relationships that had made the prison system politically viable. The tipping point came when prisoners began to realize that their individual situations were not individual at all. They were the product of decisions made by people who had never seen the inside of a prison cell, for purposes that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with maintaining a social order that benefited everyone except the people it imprisoned. This realization was dangerous because it was accurate. The prison system wasn't designed to reform criminals or deter crime. It was designed to manage the social tensions created by economic inequality in a society that was becoming more unequal with each passing year. The people in Newgate weren't there because they were more evil than the people outside. They were there because they were more visible, more vulnerable, more expendable when the system needed scapegoats. And outside the walls of Newgate, another population was reaching the same conclusion about their own relationship to the system that governed their lives. June 2nd, 1780. A Tuesday morning that began like any other, in a city that had grown accustomed to the rhythms of controlled disorder. Markets opening in Smithfield, courts convening at the Old Bailey, prisoners in Newgate beginning another day of indefinite waiting. But by afternoon, London would discover that control was an illusion, and disorder was a force of nature that no amount of architecture could contain. The petition was supposed to be peaceful. Lord George Gordon, president of the Protestant Association, had organized what he called a respectful demonstration against the Catholic Relief Act, legislation that had granted limited rights to Catholics in Britain for the first time in over a century. The plan was simple. March to Parliament, present a petition signed by 60,000 Protestant citizens, and request that their elected representatives reconsider what many saw as a dangerous accommodation to foreign influence and papal authority. 60,000 signatures. That number alone should have warned someone that this wasn't going to be a polite request for legislative review. 60,000 people don't sign petitions unless they're angry. And anger, once mobilized, has a tendency to exceed the intentions of the people who mobilized it. By 10 in the morning, crowds were gathering in St. George's Fields south of the Thames. Not the orderly assembly of middle-class petitioners that Gordon had envisioned, but something rawer and more volatile. Laborers who had lost work to immigrant Catholics, apprentices who resented competition from Catholic craftsmen, debtors who blamed their misfortunes on Catholic merchants, veterans of the American War who had returned to find their service rewarded with unemployment and indifference. These were people who had grievances that went far beyond religious doctrine. They were angry about economic displacement, political exclusion, social changes that seemed to benefit everyone except them. The Catholic Relief Act was simply the most recent example of a government that appeared to care more about appeasing minorities than protecting the interests of the Protestant majority that had supposedly built the empire. But crowds are not political organizations. They don't operate according to rational calculations of interest and strategy. They operate according to emotional physics, pressure and release, compression and explosion, action and reaction. And by noon on June 2nd, the physics were becoming unstable. The march across Westminster Bridge began with something approaching discipline. Gordon himself led the procession, wearing the blue cockade that identified Protestant Association members and carrying a copy of the petition that was supposed to be the day's only business. Behind him marched ranks of protesters who had organized themselves into rough formations, carrying banners with slogans that mixed religious rhetoric with economic grievances. No popery, no Catholic slavery, not Protestant jobs for Protestant workers. But discipline is a luxury that crowds can afford only as long as nothing unexpected happens. And London, in June 1780, was a city where unexpected things happened with the regularity of clockwork. Traffic jams where the procession met normal commercial activity, counter-demonstrations by Catholic sympathizers who had their own grievances and their own sense of righteous anger, confrontations with constables who were trying to maintain order without clear instructions about how much disorder they were authorized to suppress. Each of these incidents was minor in itself: a shoving match between Protestant marchers and Catholic bystanders, an argument between a constable and a protester over the right to carry banners on public streets, a bottleneck where the procession backed up against itself and tempers shortened with proximity. But minor incidents accumulate like static electricity, building charge until the atmosphere itself becomes explosive. By 2 in the afternoon, when the petition was finally presented to Parliament, the crowd outside had transformed from a political demonstration into something else entirely. Not quite a mob, but no longer a movement. A mass of people who had discovered that they outnumbered every form of authority that might oppose them, and who were beginning to explore what that numerical superiority might permit them to do. The rejection of the petition was almost anticlimactic. Parliament had never intended to repeal the Catholic Relief Act, and Gordon had never really expected them to. The petition was political theater designed to demonstrate Protestant strength and Catholic vulnerability. But theater requires an audience that understands they're watching a performance, and the crowd outside Parliament was no longer interested in watching. They wanted to perform. The transformation began with targets of opportunity. Catholic chapels were the obvious choice, visible symbols of the religious accommodation that had triggered the protest in the first place. But chapels are small buildings, and destroying them required only a few dozen people with crowbars and torches. The rest of the crowd needed other outlets for their energy. Gradually, the focus shifted from religious targets to institutional ones, from Catholic chapels to the houses of Catholic sympathizers, from Catholic sympathizers to anyone who had voted for the Relief Act, from individual politicians to the symbols of political authority itself. The crowd was learning what every successful revolution discovers, that the real enemy isn't any particular law or policy, but the system that produces laws and policies without consulting the people who have to live with the consequences. And the most visible symbol of that system, the most concrete representation of state power in all its arbitrary authority and architectural arrogance, was the prison that dominated Newgate Street like a stone fist raised against the sky. The approach to Newgate began around 6 in the evening. By then, the crowd had swelled to perhaps 40,000 people, a human river flowing through streets that had been designed for medieval foot traffic and cart transport. The sound alone was overwhelming. Not shouting or chanting, but the accumulated noise of thousands of conversations, arguments, threats, and encouragements blending into a roar that seemed to come from the city itself. But it was the sight that truly testified to what was happening. This wasn't a crowd in any conventional sense. It was a cross-section of London's entire population, mobilized for purposes that no one could have predicted and few could control. Laborers and merchants, apprentices and masters, women and children, protesters and curiosity seekers, who had been drawn into the flow by the simple momentum of human movement through urban space. Most importantly, it included people who had connections to Newgate. Family members of prisoners who had been waiting months or years for trials that might never come. Former prisoners who had served their sentences and returned to a city that offered them no economic opportunities except crime. Creditors of debtors who were imprisoned for failing to pay debts that had become unpayable. The entire informal network of people whose lives had been touched by the prison system's capacity to reach beyond its walls and reshape the social relationships that held the city together. These people understood what many of the other protesters did not: that Newgate wasn't just a building. It was a system, a machine for converting social problems into individual punishments, economic grievances into criminal offenses, political dissent into moral failure. Attack the building, and you were attacking the entire structure of authority that the building represented. The first stones were thrown around 7 o'clock, not at the prisoners. The crowd had no quarrel with the people trapped inside. At the building itself, at the windows that had been positioned to deny dignity to the imprisoned, at the doors that had been designed to communicate the finality of state judgment, at the facade that had been crafted to inspire fear in anyone who might consider challenging the system that the prison served. But stones are insufficient weapons against architecture designed to withstand siege warfare. Dance's walls had been built to resist everything that 18th-century military engineering could throw at them. Cannon fire, battering rams, sustained assault by professional soldiers equipped with the best weapons that contemporary technology could provide. A few thousand citizens armed with paving stones and improvised tools posed no immediate threat to the structural integrity of the building. What they posed was a political threat, because every stone thrown at Newgate was also thrown at the legitimacy of the system that Newgate embodied. Every assault on the building was also an assault on the idea that some people had the right to confine other people according to laws that the confined had never been asked to approve. The authorities understood this distinction even if the crowd did not. The physical damage was manageable. The symbolic damage was catastrophic. If a mob could attack the most secure building in London with impunity, what building was safe? If citizens could assault the primary symbol of state authority without immediate consequences, what authority remained? But understanding the problem and solving it were different challenges entirely. The magistrates who might have ordered military intervention were either absent from the city or reluctant to authorize the use of force against British citizens, exercising what they claimed were traditional rights of petition and protest. The military commanders who might have dispersed the crowd were either unavailable or uncertain about their legal authority to act without explicit civilian authorization. Most critically, the crowd was too large to disperse and too diffuse to negotiate with. 40,000 people don't have leaders in any meaningful sense. They have momentum, they have direction, they have collective interests that emerge from the intersection of individual grievances. But they don't have anyone who can speak for them or anyone who can control them if the situation requires de-escalation. What they had instead was time, uninterrupted hours to discover what was possible when the normal constraints of law and order temporarily disappeared. And what they discovered was that those constraints had always been more fragile than anyone had been willing to admit. The breakthrough came just after sunset, not through the main gates, which were secured with locks that had been forged specifically to resist this kind of assault. Through the roof, a group of protesters had discovered that the buildings adjacent to Newgate could be climbed, and that climbing them provided access to the prison's upper levels where security had been designed to prevent escape rather than invasion. Once on the roof, the crowd had access to Dance's greatest vulnerability, his own architectural success. The ventilation system that he had designed to keep prisoners alive became the pathway through which their liberation was achieved. Air shafts became human passages. Ventilation grates became doorways. The windmill that had once drawn fresh air into the building now drew people. The irony was perfect. The prison was being conquered through the very systems that had been installed to make it humane. Dance's solution to the problem of overcrowding had created the means for the prison's own destruction. The machine designed to contain disorder had become a machine for amplifying it. But conquest is different from destruction, and the crowd was about to learn that difference in the most dramatic way possible. Because Newgate contained more than prisoners and guards. It contained records, legal documents, personal possessions, and the accumulated infrastructure of decades of prison administration. Most importantly, it contained fuel. The fire began accidentally. Torches that had been brought to provide light in the building's windowless corridors, candles that had been lit to read prisoner lists and locate specific cells, open flames in a building that contained centuries of accumulated timber, fabric, paper, and other combustible materials that had never been installed with fire prevention in mind. Within an hour, the accident had become intentional, because fire solved problems that simple liberation could not. It destroyed the records that documented who was imprisoned and why. It eliminated the evidence that might later be used to identify the people who had participated in the attack. Most importantly, it transformed the assault from a temporary disruption into a permanent transformation. You can rebuild walls, you can replace locks and bars and administrative systems, but you cannot rebuild legitimacy. Once a symbol of authority has been reduced to ash and rubble, it can never again command the same automatic deference that it once enjoyed. The prison might be reconstructed, but the idea of the prison, the sense that it represented inevitable and irresistible state power, had been destroyed as thoroughly as the building itself. The fire burned through the night and into the following day. By dawn on June 3rd, Newgate was a shell. The massive stones that had embodied permanence were cracked and blackened. The iron that had symbolized strength was twisted and melted. The careful architecture that had balanced deterrence with habitability had been reduced to the most basic elements of matter and energy, but the destruction of Newgate was only the beginning, because the crowd that had discovered its own power was not going to return quietly to the powerlessness that had defined their lives before June 2nd. They had learned that buildings could be destroyed, that authority could be resisted, that the system that governed their lives was not as inevitable as they had been taught to believe. Over the next 5 days, London experienced what contemporary observers called the worst rioting in the city's history. Catholic chapels, certainly, but also the houses of judges, the offices of magistrates, the businesses of merchants who had supported the Catholic Relief Act. The Bank of England was attacked. The prisons at King's Bench and Fleet Street were stormed and burned. Distilleries were looted and their contents distributed to crowds who were already operating beyond the normal constraints of sobriety and reason. The government's response, when it finally came, was overwhelming and merciless. On June 7th, King George III authorized the use of military force to restore order. Regular army troops were deployed throughout London with orders to shoot rioters on sight. Artillery was positioned at key intersections. Cavalry patrols were sent through neighborhoods where the rioting had been most intense. The suppression was swift and brutal. Conservative estimates suggest that nearly 300 people were killed in the street fighting that followed the military intervention. Hundreds more were wounded. Thousands were arrested and subjected to mass trials that processed defendants with the speed of industrial manufacturing. By June 10th, London was quiet, but it was the quiet of exhaustion rather than satisfaction, suppression rather than resolution. The reconstruction of Newgate began almost immediately. Parliament allocated funds for rebuilding before the ashes had cooled. Architects were commissioned to design a structure that would be even more secure, even more intimidating, even more effective at deterring the kinds of challenges that had led to the building's destruction. But reconstruction is always different from original construction. The new Newgate would be built in the knowledge that the old Newgate had burned. It would be designed by people who understood that no building, however massive or well defended, could withstand the concentrated anger of a population that had lost faith in the legitimacy of the system it represented. The new prison would need to be more than secure. It would need to be invisible. More than intimidating. It would need to be accepted. More than effective. It would need to be sustainable in a political environment where citizens had demonstrated their willingness to destroy institutions that they perceived as unjust. This was a different kind of architectural problem than Dance had originally been asked to solve. Not just how to contain criminals, but how to contain the social forces that created criminals. Not just how to punish lawbreakers, but how to maintain the legitimacy of the laws themselves in a society where large numbers of people had concluded that the legal system served interests other than justice. The solution, when it came, would be characteristically English in its pragmatism and characteristically brutal in its efficiency. The new Newgate would be designed not just to imprison bodies, but to imprison minds, not just to contain individual criminals, but to shape public consciousness about crime, punishment, and the proper relationship between citizen and state. But that solution would take years to implement and decades to perfect. In the meantime, London had to live with the knowledge that its most secure building had been destroyed by its own citizens, that its system of justice had been rejected by the very people it was supposed to serve, that the machine designed to contain disorder had generated more disorder than it had ever been designed to prevent. The burned stones of Newgate lay in Newgate Street like an accusation against everyone who passed them, evidence that power was not inevitable, that authority was not permanent, that the systems that governed human life could be unmade by the same human forces that had made them. It would be 3 years before the new prison opened its doors. 3 years during which London's criminals were processed through temporary facilities that everyone understood were inadequate. 3 years during which the absence of Newgate served as a daily reminder that the city's solution to social disorder had become a source of social disorder itself. And when the new building finally rose from the ashes of the old one, it would carry with it the memory of June 1780. The knowledge that architecture, however magnificent, was no match for human desperation. that buildings, however secure, were vulnerable to the people they were designed to contain. The new Newgate would be stronger than its predecessor, but it would also be more isolated, more defended, more conscious of its own vulnerability. It would be designed by people who had learned that the greatest threat to a prison comes not from the prisoners inside, but from the citizens outside who might decide that the prison itself had become the problem. This was the lesson of the Gordon riots. Not that crowds were dangerous, that had always been obvious, but that institutions could lose legitimacy so completely that their destruction became a form of public service, that the tools of social control could become the targets of social revolution, that the line between order and disorder was thinner than anyone had imagined and more easily crossed than anyone had wanted to believe. The physical evidence of that crossing was visible in the rubble that filled Newgate Street through the summer of 1780. Massive stone blocks that had been cut with mathematical precision and fitted together with engineering expertise lay scattered like children's toys after a tantrum. Iron bars that had been forged to last centuries were twisted into shapes that suggested the tremendous heat required to make metal flow like water. Door frames that had been designed to contain the worst criminals in England stood empty, opening onto nothing but sky and the accumulated debris of institutional collapse. But the most devastating damage wasn't physical. It was documentary. The fire had consumed not just the building, but the records that the building had housed. Prisoner lists that documented who was confined and why. Legal files that tracked the progress of cases through the court system. Financial records that detailed the fees paid and services provided. Administrative correspondence that revealed how decisions were made about sentences, transfers, pardons, and executions. All of it gone, reduced to ash that blew through London streets like gray snow, carrying with it the fragments of a bureaucratic system that had taken centuries to develop and minutes to destroy. The institutional memory of English criminal justice had been erased as completely as if it had never existed. This documentary destruction created problems that extended far beyond the immediate crisis of where to house London's criminals. Prisoners who had been in Newgate during the riot found themselves in legal limbo. Without records to document their offenses, their sentences, or their time served, how could the authorities determine what should happen to them next? Some had been awaiting trial for minor offenses and might legally be entitled to immediate release. Others had been sentenced to transportation or execution and represented genuine threats to public safety if freed inappropriately. Families of prisoners faced their own form of limbo. Fathers, brothers, and sons who had been confined in Newgate had either escaped during the riot or perished in the fire, but without official records, there was no way to determine which fate had befallen which prisoner. The authorities couldn't provide information they didn't possess. Relatives were left to search through the refugee camps that had formed around London as displaced prisoners sought shelter and support. The court system itself was paralyzed. Judges who arrived at the Old Bailey to conduct trials found their dockets empty because the prisoners who were supposed to appear were either dead, escaped, or confined in temporary facilities where record-keeping was too chaotic to support formal legal proceedings. Cases that had been in progress for months or years had to be restarted from the beginning, assuming that witnesses could be located and evidence could be reconstructed. But perhaps the most significant consequence was political. The destruction of Newgate had demonstrated that London's approach to criminal justice was vulnerable to popular rejection in ways that no one had previously imagined. The crowds that burned the prison weren't criminals protesting their own treatment. They were citizens protesting a system that they perceived as fundamentally unjust. This raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between law and legitimacy in a society that claimed to derive its authority from popular consent. If large numbers of citizens were willing to destroy the institutions that enforced the law, what did that suggest about their consent to be governed by those laws? If the prison system could be rejected so completely that its physical destruction was celebrated rather than mourned, what did that suggest about the system's claim to serve justice rather than mere power? The government's response to these questions was characteristically pragmatic and characteristically authoritarian. Rather than examining whether the criminal justice system required fundamental reform, They focused on ensuring that it could never again be successfully challenged by popular uprising. The new Newgate would be designed not just to contain prisoners, but to withstand siege. The architectural plans that emerged from this analysis read like military engineering specifications rather than prison design documents. Walls that would be thicker than those of medieval castles, windows that would be positioned too high for any external assault, drainage systems that would be designed to resist flooding, poisoning, or other forms of sabotage. Most importantly, defensive features that would allow a small garrison to hold the building against a large attacking force indefinitely. But military engineering was expensive, and Parliament was reluctant to appropriate the funds necessary to build a fortress in the middle of London. The estimates for reconstructing Newgate according to the new security requirements exceeded the cost of the original building by a factor of 3. At a time when the American War was consuming enormous sums and generating questionable returns, the prospect of spending equivalent amounts on domestic architecture was politically problematic. The solution was delay. Rather than rushing to rebuild Newgate, the authorities would take time to study the problem thoroughly, consult with experts, and develop a comprehensive plan that would address all of the vulnerabilities that the June riots had revealed. In the meantime, London's criminals would be housed in temporary facilities that were admittedly inadequate, but that would serve until a permanent solution could be implemented. This delay was presented as prudent planning, but it was actually political strategy. The immediate aftermath of the riots had generated enormous public sympathy for law and order, but public sympathy is ephemeral. By postponing reconstruction, the government allowed time for memories to fade and emotions to cool. When the new prison was finally built, it would face less scrutiny and less opposition than would have been the case if construction had begun immediately after the destruction. The temporary facilities that housed London's prisoners during this interregnum were revealing in their inadequacy. Makeshift cells constructed in warehouses, cellars, and abandoned buildings throughout the city. Security systems that relied on locks that any skilled craftsman could defeat, and guards who were recruited from the ranks of unemployed laborers with no training in prison administration. Conditions that made the old Newgate look humane by comparison, but these facilities also served an important ideological function. They demonstrated to the public what criminal justice looked like without proper institutional support. The chaos, the inefficiency, the obvious security risks, the casual brutality that resulted when imprisonment was managed as an emergency measure rather than a systematic process. By 1783, public opinion had shifted decisively in favor of rebuilding Newgate according to the highest standards that contemporary architecture could achieve. The temporary facilities had become an embarrassment to a city that prided itself on institutional sophistication. More importantly, they had become a practical problem for a legal system that required reliable methods of prisoner containment to function effectively. The new Newgate that finally opened its doors in 1783 was everything that the original planners had hoped to achieve, and everything that the rioters had hoped to prevent. Larger, more secure, more efficiently organized, and more completely isolated from the surrounding community. But it was also something new in the history of English criminal justice, a building that had been designed with full awareness that it might be attacked by the very citizens it was supposed to serve. This awareness shaped every aspect of the new prison's design and operation. The facade was imposing but not provocatively so. The security systems were comprehensive but largely invisible from the street. The internal organization was designed to prevent riots among prisoners, while the external defenses were designed to prevent riots by citizens. Most importantly, the new Newgate was designed to minimize public visibility of the prison system's operations. The old prison had been deliberately prominent, positioned to remind passers-by of the consequences of lawbreaking. The new prison was deliberately discreet, designed to perform its functions without attracting attention that might generate sympathy for prisoners or criticism of the system that had imprisoned them. But perhaps the most significant innovation was the decision to move public executions from their traditional location at Tyburn to a site directly outside the prison gates. This change was presented as a matter of administrative efficiency, reducing the cost and complexity of transporting condemned prisoners across London for their executions. but it was actually a matter of political control. Executions at Tyburn had become public festivals that attracted crowds numbering in the tens of thousands. These crowds were largely sympathetic to the condemned prisoners, whom they saw as victims of an unjust system rather than threats to public safety. The journey from Newgate to Tyburn had become a procession where prisoners were cheered, guards were jeered, and the entire spectacle served to undermine rather than reinforce the authority of the legal system. Moving executions to Newgate eliminated the procession and reduced the crowds to manageable sizes. More importantly, it placed executions under the direct control of prison authorities who could regulate attendance, control behavior, and ensure that the spectacle served the state's purposes rather than providing a platform for popular dissent. The first execution outside the new Newgate took place on December 9, 1783. The condemned man was a highway robber named John Austin, who had been convicted of attacking coaches on the road between London and Bath. His crime was serious, but not exceptional. His execution was routine by the standards of 18th-century criminal justice, but the location and manner of his death established a precedent that would shape public executions for the next 85 years. The gallows were erected directly in front of the prison's main entrance, creating a visual connection between confinement and death that had never before been so explicit. The crowd was limited to perhaps 500 spectators who were kept at a distance that prevented them from communicating with the condemned man or interfering with the proceedings. Guards were positioned throughout the area with orders to suppress any demonstration of sympathy or support for the prisoner. The effect was exactly what the authorities had intended. Austin's execution proceeded without incident. The crowd observed in respectful silence. The spectacle reinforced rather than undermined the impression that the legal system operated according to rational principles and served legitimate purposes. Justice had been seen to be done, and it had been seen to be done in a manner that reflected credit on the institutions that had administered it. But the new system also eliminated something that had been central to English criminal justice for centuries: the possibility that public sympathy might provide a final check on official power. At Tyburn, crowds had sometimes intervened to prevent executions they considered unjust. Prisoners had been able to address their final words to sympathetic audiences who might carry their stories back into the broader community. Executions had been public events in the fullest sense, occasions when the community participated in the administration of justice rather than merely witnessing it. Outside Newgate, executions became bureaucratic procedures, efficient, orderly, professional, but also isolated from the community that had supposedly authorized them. The public could observe but not participate. They could witness but not intervene. They could see justice being done, but they could no longer influence what kind of justice was done or how it was carried out. This transformation of public execution from community ritual to state ceremony represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between government and citizen in English society. Justice was no longer something that the community administered through its representatives. It was something that the state administered on behalf of the community, with or without the community's active consent. The new Newgate embodied this shift in every aspect of its design and operation. It was a machine for processing criminals that required no input from the larger society except the periodic delivery of new prisoners and the periodic removal of executed ones. Everything that happened between delivery and disposal was the exclusive concern of professionals who were accountable to other professionals rather than to the public that had supposedly authorized their actions. This isolation was presented as progress: rational administration replacing mob rule, professional competence replacing popular prejudice, scientific penology replacing traditional vengeance. But it was also a form of estrangement. The community that had once participated directly in the administration of justice found itself excluded from institutions that claimed to serve its interests while operating according to principles it was not qualified to understand. The rebuilt Newgate stood as a monument to this estrangement, not just a prison, but a symbol of a society that had decided that justice was too important to be left to the people it was supposed to serve. The new Newgate was designed to be seen, Not like the old prison, which had demanded attention through architectural intimidation, but in a different way entirely. It was designed to be seen working, to demonstrate through its smooth operation that English justice was both firm and fair, both powerful and humane, that the state could punish without cruelty, deter without barbarism, execute without spectacle. This was the theory. In practice, spectacle was exactly what the new system produced, because moving executions from Tyburn to Newgate Street didn't eliminate public interest in watching people die. It concentrated that interest into a more manageable form. And concentrated interest, when applied to the deliberate killing of human beings, creates its own peculiar chemistry. The crowds that gathered for executions outside Newgate were different from the crowds that had gathered at Tyburn. Smaller, certainly, more orderly, obviously, but also more intense. At Tyburn, executions had been festivals where death was one entertainment among many. Outside Newgate, executions became theatrical performances where death was the only entertainment that mattered. The difference was architectural as much as social. Tyburn had been an open space where crowds could disperse and conversations could develop, and the condemned prisoner was just one figure among many in a landscape of vendors, pickpockets, clergy, curiosity seekers, and sympathizers. Newgate Street was a confined space where everyone's attention was focused on a single point: the gallows erected directly in front of the prison's main entrance. The gallows themselves were a masterpiece of engineering designed to serve symbolic as well as practical purposes. The platform was elevated high enough to ensure that spectators at the back of the crowd could witness the execution clearly. The trapdoor was designed to open with mechanical precision, eliminating the possibility of botched hangings that might generate sympathy for the condemned. The rope was positioned to ensure that death would be quick and clean, avoiding the prolonged struggles that had sometimes turned executions into arguments against capital punishment itself. But the most important innovation was timing. Executions at Tyburn had taken place according to schedules that accommodated the convenience of the condemned prisoner, the availability of clergy, and the logistics of transportation across London. Executions outside Newgate took place according to schedules that maximized their impact on public consciousness. Monday mornings, when the largest number of workers would be passing through the area on their way to employment. Mid-morning hours, when the light was good and visibility was optimal. Seasons when weather was unlikely to interfere with attendance or observation. These considerations transformed execution from legal procedure into public relations. Each hanging was planned like a theatrical production, with careful attention to staging, lighting, timing, and audience management. The goal wasn't just to kill the condemned prisoner efficiently. It was to communicate messages about justice, authority, and the consequences of challenging either. The messages were multiple and sometimes contradictory. To potential criminals, this is what happens to people who break the law. To law-abiding citizens, the system protects you by eliminating threats to your safety. To political dissidents, the state has both the power and the will to kill its opponents. To foreign observers, English justice is superior to continental alternatives because it operates according to rational procedures rather than arbitrary power. But perhaps the most important message was directed at the prisoners still confined inside Newgate itself, because every execution outside the prison walls was also an execution inside the prison's consciousness. Every condemned prisoner who walked from the cells to the gallows was walking a path that other prisoners might someday be forced to follow. Every crowd that gathered to watch someone die was also a crowd that might someday gather to watch them die. This proximity to death was central to the new Newgate's effectiveness as an instrument of social control. Prisoners didn't just know that execution was possible. They could hear the construction of gallows in the street outside. They could hear the crowds gathering on execution mornings. They could hear the final preparations, the reading of sentences, the prayers and final statements. Most importantly, they could hear the silence that followed the opening of the trapdoor. That silence was perhaps the most carefully engineered aspect of the entire system. The gallows were positioned so that the sound of the execution would carry into the prison, but the sight would be blocked by walls and barriers. Prisoners could know that someone had died without seeing exactly how they had died. This combination of auditory certainty and visual uncertainty maximized the psychological impact while minimizing the possibility that witnessing execution might generate sympathy rather than fear. The system worked by any measure that mattered to the authorities who had designed it. Crime rates in London remained stable despite the rapid growth of the city's population. The courts processed cases efficiently without generating the backlogs that had characterized the old system. Most importantly, there were no more riots, no more popular uprisings against the institutions of criminal justice, no more crowds storming prisons or attacking symbols of state authority. But the system also produced something that its designers had not anticipated: a culture of spectatorship that transformed execution from punishment into entertainment. Because the crowds that gathered for hangings outside Newgate were not there to participate in the administration of justice, they were there to watch justice being administered by professionals on their behalf. This was a fundamental change in the social meaning of execution. At Tyburn, crowds had been participants. They could intervene to prevent hangings they considered unjust. They could express sympathy for prisoners they considered victims of circumstance. They could turn executions into political demonstrations against the system that had condemned the prisoners. Outside Newgate, crowds became audiences. They could watch but not participate. They could observe but not influence. They could be entertained but not involved. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. By the 1790s, execution days had become regular social occasions that attracted visitors from throughout England and the continent. Hotels near Newgate advertised special rates for execution mornings. Vendors sold food, drink, and souvenirs to crowds that might number in the tens of thousands for particularly notorious criminals. Newspapers published detailed accounts of hangings that read like theatrical reviews, complete with commentary on the condemned prisoner's demeanor, final words, and manner of dying. This commercialization of execution revealed something disturbing about the relationship between justice and entertainment in a society that claimed to be both civilized and Christian. The same crowds that gathered to hear sermons about mercy and forgiveness on Sunday gathered to watch human beings being killed for their entertainment on Monday. The same newspapers that published editorials about moral progress published advertisements for the best viewing locations for upcoming hangings. But the most troubling aspect of execution as entertainment was its effect on the prisoners who were forced to perform in these lethal theatrical productions. Because that's what execution outside Newgate became, a performance where the condemned prisoner was expected to play a specific role for the education and entertainment of the crowd. The ideal condemned prisoner, from the authorities' perspective, was one who accepted responsibility for their crimes, expressed remorse for their actions, forgave their enemies, and died with dignity that reflected credit on the system that had condemned them. Such prisoners demonstrated that English justice was firm but fair, that even the worst criminals could be redeemed through proper legal procedure, and that death sentences were imposed reluctantly by judges who took no pleasure in the necessity of killing. Prisoners who failed to play this role created problems that extended beyond the immediate execution. Those who protested their innocence undermined public confidence in the legal system's accuracy. Those who criticized the justice of their sentences undermined public confidence in the legal system's fairness. Those who died badly, struggling, screaming, or losing bodily control undermined public confidence in the legal system's humanity. The solution was coaching. Condemned prisoners were visited regularly by clergy who helped them prepare spiritually for death and practically for the performance that death would require. They were instructed in the proper words to speak from the gallows, the proper demeanor to maintain during their final moments, and the proper way to demonstrate that they accepted their fate as just punishment for their crimes. This coaching was presented as spiritual counseling, but it was actually script development. The goal wasn't to save the prisoner's soul. That was a secondary consideration. The goal was to ensure that the prisoner's death would serve the state's purposes by reinforcing rather than undermining public support for capital punishment. The scripts that emerged from this process were remarkably similar, regardless of the prisoner's actual crime, background, or personal beliefs. acknowledgement of guilt, expression of remorse, forgiveness of enemies, warning to others not to follow the same path, gratitude for the mercy shown by the court in allowing time for repentance, acceptance of death as just punishment deserved for breaking God's law and the king's law. These standardized final statements transformed execution from individual tragedy into institutional propaganda. Each hanging became an opportunity for the state to deliver messages about law, order, morality, and the proper relationship between citizen and authority. The condemned prisoner's voice became the state's voice, speaking words that served the state's interests rather than expressing the prisoner's actual thoughts or feelings. But scripts are only as effective as the actors who perform them, and condemned prisoners were notoriously unreliable performers. Some refused to follow their scripts entirely, using their final moments to protest their innocence or criticize the system that had condemned them. Others followed their scripts mechanically, delivering their lines with such obvious insincerity that the performance undermined rather than supported the messages it was supposed to convey. Most problematically, some prisoners used their scripted final statements as opportunities for subversion. They would acknowledge their guilt while simultaneously describing the circumstances that had led to their crimes in ways that generated sympathy rather than condemnation. They would express remorse while also explaining how poverty, injustice, or systemic inequality had left them no viable alternatives to criminal behavior. These subversive performances revealed the fundamental vulnerability of execution as public theater. The condemned prisoner always had the last word, and last words could be used to challenge the very system that was in the process of silencing the speaker forever. No amount of coaching could guarantee that a prisoner facing imminent death would prioritize the state's interests over their own desire to tell their story truthfully. By the early 19th century, this vulnerability was generating serious concerns among the authorities responsible for managing public executions. Too many condemned prisoners were using their final moments to deliver political speeches rather than moral lessons. Too many crowds were responding to these speeches with sympathy rather than satisfaction. Too many executions were serving as occasions for criticism of the legal system rather than celebration of its effectiveness. The problem was compounded by changing social attitudes toward violence and suffering that made public execution increasingly difficult to justify as educational rather than merely brutal. Religious reformers argued that watching people die hardened spectators to violence and degraded their moral sensitivity. Political reformers argued that execution crowds became training grounds for mob behavior that might be turned against other institutions. Medical reformers argued that the excitement generated by public hangings created public health risks that threatened the welfare of communities. But the most powerful critique came from an unexpected source: women, because the crowds that gathered for executions outside Newgate included increasing numbers of women and children, whose presence changed the social dynamics of the events in ways that made the brutality more visible and less acceptable. Women at executions didn't behave like men at executions. They were more likely to express sympathy for condemned prisoners, more likely to criticize the justice of particular sentences, more likely to interpret executions as tragedies rather than triumphs of justice. Most importantly, they were more likely to see themselves as potential victims of a system that could kill anyone who fell afoul of laws they hadn't been consulted about making. This female presence at executions created a paradox for authorities who had designed public hanging as a form of education for potential criminals. If the lesson of execution was supposed to be that crime doesn't pay, why were women and children, who were statistically unlikely to commit capital crimes, attending these lessons in such large numbers? If execution was supposed to deter criminal behavior, why was it attracting audiences that included the very populations it was supposedly protecting? The answer was uncomfortable for a society that preferred to think of capital punishment as rational policy rather than popular entertainment. Women and children attended executions for the same reason that men attended, because watching people die was exciting, because the deliberate killing of human beings generated emotional responses that ordinary life rarely provided, because execution offered a socially sanctioned opportunity to witness the ultimate exercise of power over powerlessness. But acknowledging this reality would have undermined the moral justification for public execution entirely. If hangings were entertainment rather than education, if they attracted crowds through appeal to bloodlust rather than sense of justice, then they were spectacles rather than ceremonies. And spectacles, however popular, could not claim the moral authority that ceremonies required. The solution, when it finally came, was characteristically English in its compromise between principle and pragmatism. Public executions would not be abolished. That would suggest weakness in the face of criminal behavior. But they would be moved indoors, away from the crowds that had made them problematic. Justice would continue to be done, but it would no longer need to be seen to be done by anyone except a small number of official witnesses. The legislation that ended public executions was passed in 1868, 88 years after the Gordon riots and 85 years after the first execution outside the rebuilt Newgate. The timing was not coincidental. By 1868, the generation that remembered the riots was dead. The political conditions that had made public execution seem necessary had changed. Most importantly, alternative methods of social control had been developed that made execution less central to the maintenance of public order. But the end of public execution also marked the end of something else, the last vestige of community participation in the administration of criminal justice. Once executions moved inside prison walls, they became entirely professional procedures administered by specialists according to protocols that the public was not qualified to understand or authorized to influence. This professionalization of death was presented as progress. Humane administration replacing barbaric spectacle. Scientific penology replacing popular vengeance. Rational procedure replacing mob rule. But it was also a form of estrangement. The community that had once participated directly in the ultimate exercise of state power found itself excluded from institutions that claimed to serve its interests while operating according to principles it was not permitted to examine. The last public execution outside Newgate took place on May 26, 1868. The condemned man was Michael Barrett, an Irish nationalist who had been convicted of bombing Clerkenwell Prison in an attempt to free Fenian prisoners. His crime was political, his trial was controversial, and his execution was intended to demonstrate that the British state would not tolerate terrorist violence regardless of its political motivation. Barrett's hanging proceeded without incident. He delivered a final statement that followed the approved script, acknowledging his guilt and expressing remorse for his actions. The crowd observed in respectful silence. Justice was seen to be done in a manner that reflected credit on the institutions that had administered it. By every official measure, the execution was a success, but it was also an ending. After May 1868, condemned prisoners would die in private, attended only by officials whose job was to ensure that the killing was carried out efficiently and humanely. The community that had once witnessed these deaths directly would receive only sanitized reports in newspapers that emphasized the dignity of the proceedings and the justice of the outcomes. This shift from public to private execution marked the final transformation of Newgate from a community institution to a state institution. The prison had begun as a local jail that served the immediate needs of London's courts and citizens. It had evolved into a regional facility that processed criminals from throughout southeastern England. It ended as a national symbol that embodied abstract principles of justice rather than concrete relationships between law and community. But symbols are vulnerable in ways that institutions are not. By 1900, Newgate had become an embarrassment to a society that preferred to think of itself as progressive and humane. The building itself was a reminder of an approach to criminal justice that seemed increasingly archaic. The conditions inside the prison were a constant source of criticism from reformers who demanded more humane treatment of prisoners. Most importantly, the location in central London made the prison a highly visible symbol of state violence in a city that was trying to present itself as the capital of civilization and enlightenment. The decision to close Newgate was made in 1900, but the actual closure took 2 years to implement. Prisoners had to be transferred to other facilities. Staff had to be reassigned or pensioned. Records had to be archived or transferred to other institutions. The bureaucratic process of shutting down a prison that had operated continuously for over 6 centuries was almost as complex as the process of building it had been. But the most complex aspect of closing Newgate was deciding what to do with the building itself. The structure was too massive to ignore and too notorious to convert to ordinary civilian use. Leaving it empty would create a monument to abandoned policies. Converting it to other purposes would require enormous expense and would never completely eliminate its associations with suffering and death. The solution was demolition, complete, systematic, thorough removal of every stone and bar and door that had comprised the physical structure of London's most famous prison. The building would be erased as completely as if it had never existed, and the site would be used for purposes that bore no relationship to its previous function. Demolition began in 1903 and continued into 1904. The work proceeded with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized the prison's construction 2 centuries earlier. Walls that had been built to last forever were dismantled stone by stone. Iron that had been forged to contain the worst criminals in England was cut up and sold for scrap. Doors that had been designed to resist battering rams were loaded onto carts and hauled away like ordinary refuse. But some elements of the prison proved more difficult to eliminate than others. The foundations, which extended deep into London's geological substrate, could not be completely removed without destabilizing the surrounding buildings. Some of the masonry was so well constructed that dismantling it would have cost more than the materials were worth. Most importantly, the underground drainage systems that had been built to serve the prison were too integrated with London's larger infrastructure to be safely abandoned. These remnants meant that Newgate never completely disappeared. Even after the building was gone, traces of its presence remained embedded in the street layout, the foundation patterns, and the underground systems that continued to serve the area. The prison had been erased from view, but not from the geological and architectural DNA of the neighborhood that had housed it. The site itself was sold to the City of London Corporation, which used it to expand the Central Criminal Court that had been built adjacent to the prison in 1824. This choice was both practical and symbolic. Practical because the legal infrastructure necessary to support a major court already existed in the area. Symbolic because it represented the transformation from one form of criminal justice to another. The Old Bailey, as the expanded court came to be known, embodied the same principles that had governed the later years of Newgate's operation: professional administration replacing community participation, rational procedure replacing popular involvement, expert judgment replacing democratic oversight. But unlike Newgate, the Old Bailey was designed to be open to public observation. Citizens could attend trials, observe proceedings, and witness the administration of justice even if they could not participate in it directly. This transparency was intended to address the criticisms that had been directed at the closed, professional systems that had replaced the old forms of community involvement in criminal justice. The public could see that trials were conducted fairly, that evidence was evaluated objectively, that sentences were imposed rationally. They could be confident that justice was being done even if they could not influence how it was done. But transparency is not the same as participation, and observation is not the same as involvement. The citizens who attended trials at the Old Bailey were spectators rather than participants. They could watch justice being administered, but they could not affect its administration. They could see that the system worked, but they could not determine how it worked or for whose benefit it worked. This was the final lesson of Newgate's history: the evolution from community institution to professional service, from democratic participation to expert administration, from public involvement to private efficiency. The prison had begun as an extension of medieval London's collective life. It ended as a monument to the modern state's capacity to manage social problems through specialized institutions that operated independently of the communities they served. Today, walking past the Old Bailey on Newgate Street, there are no obvious reminders that one of England's most notorious prisons once stood on this site. A few fragments of old masonry are embedded in newer buildings. Some of the street patterns still reflect the footprint of the demolished structures, but for the most part, The physical evidence of Newgate's existence has been erased as completely as the institutional memory of community participation in criminal justice. Yet the questions that Newgate raised remain unanswered. How should societies balance the need for order with the demand for justice? How should institutions designed to serve communities remain accountable to those communities? How should professional expertise be reconciled with democratic oversight? Most importantly, how should citizens relate to systems of power that claim to serve their interests while operating according to principles they are not qualified to understand? These are not historical questions. They are contemporary questions that every society must answer for itself. And the answers that modern societies give to these questions will determine whether their institutions serve justice or merely power, whether their systems promote community or merely control, whether their progress represents evolution or merely change. The story of Newgate is the story of how one society answered these questions. Whether those answers were correct remains for other societies and other times to judge. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Newgate's legacy lies not in the questions it raised about justice and power, but in the questions it raised about human nature itself, because the prison's history reveals something disturbing about the relationship between civilization and cruelty, between progress and violence, between the aspiration to create humane institutions and the tendency of those institutions to become instruments of inhumanity. Every generation that administered Newgate believed it was improving upon the barbarism of its predecessors. Medieval administrators believed that systematic fees were more rational than arbitrary violence. Post-fire architects believed that professional design was more humane than organic development. 18th-century reformers believed that segregation by class was more just than random mixing of prisoners. 19th-century officials believed that private execution was more civilized than public spectacle. Each of these beliefs contained elements of truth. Systematic administration was generally preferable to arbitrary brutality. Professional architecture did create more livable spaces than accidental construction. Class segregation did reduce some forms of violence between prisoners. Private execution did eliminate some of the worst aspects of crowd behavior at public hangings. But each improvement also created new forms of suffering that its advocates had not anticipated. Systematic fees created more efficient methods of exploitation. Professional architecture created more sophisticated forms of psychological torture. Class segregation created more systematic forms of social humiliation. Private execution created more complete forms of community estrangement from the administration of justice. The pattern suggests something troubling about the nature of institutional reform. Each generation's solution to the problems created by previous generations becomes the foundation for new problems that the next generation will be forced to address. Progress becomes a kind of spiral where improvements in efficiency and rationality are achieved at the cost of humanity and community. This is not to argue that no progress was made in the administration of criminal justice during Newgate's 7 centuries of operation. Conditions in the prison of 1902 were genuinely better than conditions in the prison of 1200. Prisoners in the later periods were better fed, better housed, and better protected from arbitrary violence than their medieval predecessors. The legal procedures that governed imprisonment had become more systematic, more predictable, and more attentive to individual rights. But these improvements were achieved through a process that gradually removed criminal justice from community oversight and placed it in the hands of professional specialists who claimed expertise that ordinary citizens could not challenge. The price of better treatment for prisoners was less democracy in the administration of justice. The cost of more rational procedures was less community participation in their development and implementation. This trade-off between expertise and democracy remains one of the central tensions in modern societies. Professional administration generally produces more consistent and predictable results than democratic oversight. But democratic oversight generally produces more legitimacy and community support than professional administration. Societies that emphasize expertise at the expense of democracy risk creating institutions that are efficient but illegitimate. Societies that emphasize democracy at the expense of expertise risk creating institutions that are popular but incompetent. Newgate's history suggests that this tension cannot be resolved through institutional design alone. Every architectural solution, every administrative procedure, every reform program creates new problems that require new solutions. The process is endless because human beings are complex creatures who resist simple solutions to the problems they create for each other. But the history also suggests that some approaches to this tension are more sustainable than others. Institutions that remain connected to the communities they serve are more likely to retain legitimacy over time. Procedures that remain transparent to public scrutiny are more likely to avoid corruption and abuse. Reforms that include rather than exclude community participation are more likely to generate lasting improvements rather than temporary fixes. The great tragedy of Newgate's evolution was not that it became more efficient or more professional. The tragedy was that it became more isolated from the community it was supposed to serve. Each reform made the prison more rational but less accountable. Each improvement made the system more effective but less legitimate. Each advance in professional expertise was accompanied by a retreat from democratic oversight. This isolation reached its logical conclusion with the closure of Newgate itself. By 1902, the prison had become so estranged from London's community life that its elimination generated no significant protest or resistance. The institution that had once been central to the city's identity had become peripheral to its concerns. Justice had become something that happened elsewhere, administered by specialists, according to procedures that ordinary citizens were not expected to understand or influence. The demolition of Newgate's physical structure completed a process that had been underway for centuries: the separation of criminal justice from community life. The stones that had once housed London's most notorious prisoners were sold as building materials for projects that had no connection to the prison's history or purposes. The iron that had once confined the city's criminals was melted down and reforged for uses that bore no relationship to its previous function. But the most complete erasure was not physical. It was cultural. Within a generation of Newgate's closure, the institutional memory of community participation in criminal justice had largely disappeared. Citizens who had once expected to be involved in the administration of justice came to expect that justice would be administered for them by professionals who were accountable to other professionals rather than to the public. This transformation was so complete that by the middle of the 20th century, most citizens had no memory of any alternative to professional criminal justice administration. The idea that communities had once participated directly in deciding who should be imprisoned and how they should be treated seemed as archaic as medieval medicine or Renaissance astronomy. Yet the problems that Newgate was designed to solve, crime, disorder, the tension between individual freedom and community safety, remain as pressing in the 21st century as they were in the 13th. Modern societies continue to struggle with questions about how to punish criminals without creating more crime, how to maintain order without destroying freedom, how to protect communities without abandoning the individuals who threaten community safety. The solutions that contemporary societies have developed to these problems would be recognizable to the administrators of Newgate. Larger prisons housing more prisoners for longer periods. More sophisticated classification systems that segregate different categories of offenders. More professional administration that removes criminal justice from direct community oversight. More efficient procedures that process cases with industrial speed and precision. But these solutions also reproduce many of the problems that Newgate's history reveals: isolation of criminal justice from community life, concentration of power in the hands of professional specialists who are accountable primarily to other professionals, emphasis on efficiency and consistency at the expense of legitimacy and participation, treatment of crime as an individual pathology rather than a community problem requiring community solutions. Most troublingly, modern criminal justice systems often reproduce Newgate's fundamental design flaw. They treat symptoms rather than causes. They respond to crime by imprisoning criminals rather than by addressing the social conditions that produce criminal behavior. They solve the immediate problem of removing dangerous individuals from community life while creating new problems that future generations will be forced to address. This is not to suggest that imprisonment is never appropriate or that professional administration is inherently illegitimate. Some individuals do pose genuine threats to community safety that require isolation and containment. Some aspects of criminal justice administration do require specialized expertise that ordinary citizens cannot be expected to possess. But Newgate's history suggests that these necessities should be recognized as necessary evils rather than positive goods. Imprisonment should be understood as a failure of community institutions rather than a success of state institutions. Professional administration should be seen as a temporary expedient rather than a permanent solution. The goal should be to minimize the need for both rather than to perfect their operation. This perspective requires a fundamental shift in how societies think about crime and punishment. Instead of asking how to build better prisons, the question becomes how to build better communities that produce fewer prisoners. Instead of asking how to make criminal justice more efficient, the question becomes how to make it more democratic. Instead of asking how to perfect the administration of punishment, the question becomes how to prevent the conditions that make punishment necessary. These are not easy questions, and they do not admit of simple answers, but they are the questions that Newgate's history suggests are worth asking. Because the alternative, the endless cycle of institutional reform that improves efficiency while sacrificing legitimacy, that perfects procedures while abandoning principles, leads ultimately to the kind of estrangement from justice that Newgate's story so powerfully illustrates. The site where Newgate once stood continues to serve the administration of criminal justice. The Old Bailey processes thousands of cases each year with efficiency that would have impressed Dance and his contemporaries. Defendants receive fair trials, evidence is evaluated objectively, sentences are imposed rationally, justice is done, and it is done well by any professional standard. But it is done by professionals, for professionals, according to procedures that the community is expected to trust rather than understand. The citizens who walk past the Old Bailey each day are as removed from the administration of justice as the citizens who once walked past Newgate's forbidding walls. They can observe the results of the system's operation, but they cannot influence its procedures or priorities. This is both Newgate's legacy and its lesson. The prison that began as an instrument of community justice ended as a monument to professional administration. The institution that was designed to serve the public became increasingly isolated from public oversight. The system that was created to solve the problem of crime became a problem that required its own solution. Whether modern societies can learn from this history remains to be seen. Whether they can develop approaches to criminal justice that combine professional competence with democratic accountability, that address crime as a community problem rather than an individual pathology, that treat imprisonment as a last resort rather than a first response. These questions remain open, but the questions themselves are Newgate's most important contribution to contemporary discussions of crime and punishment. Not answers, which every generation must develop for itself, but questions that force each generation to examine the relationship between the institutions they create and the values they claim to serve. In the end, that may be the most fitting memorial for a prison that housed London's criminals for 7 centuries and then disappeared without a trace. Not a monument in stone or bronze, but a set of questions that continue to challenge societies that claim to pursue justice while struggling with the eternal human problems of disorder, inequality, and the proper limits of state power over individual liberty.